Okay. Well, yeah, awesome. Okay. Welcome everyone. Right now, Professor Pooley is going to talk to us about the economics of race. So no further ado, thank you, Professor Pooley.
Hi, everyone. What I can do, I've got some images and graphics to sort of ground the conversation. And that's really what I'm hoping this will be, is a conversation that we can, grapple with any questions people may have, comments, concerns, whatever's bringing you to the discussion. So by no means is this meant to be a lecture. They're just some pretty powerful charts and graphs and maps that at least could get us talking. And so that's the intent of me sharing these images, just to sort of round through the story. We're talking economics and race, sort of the connection between racial disparities in terms of income. We're not going to just talk about income, though. We're also going to talk about wealth, which is a big part of the story. And so what are some of the things behind those? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen. This. All right, so we can get through our economics and race slides. So as I mentioned, here's what I want to show sort of straight off the bat. And this is why we're going to be talking about not just disparities in terms of income. What you see up here, that's the graph on the left, sort of how median incomes compare between white and Black families. And there are certainly discrepancies there, and we can talk through those for sure. That relates to whether it's differences in, typically job experiences, and there are a lot of reasons why there are differences in terms of wage rates and income levels for white and Black families. And so just so that you know what you're looking for, I got up there what the figure is for both of those groups. It's a little over 60,000 for white families. It's a little over 35,000 for Black families. And that percentage there just gives you an idea. Black median income is the equivalent to about 58% of the white median. And so that's all the figures that are up there on that graph. But if you look to the right, the graph on the right shows trends in wealth. And so wealth isn't necessarily what a family would make in a year from a job, but sort of the money that's in the bank, for lack of a better way of illustrating what that is. And you can see a lot of ups and downs. What you're seeing, with some of those ups and downs over the, right around 2007, that year's called out on the graph because that was the Great Recession, and the economy went through a significant upheaval, in advance of the current upheaval that we're in the midst of. But you see at the end there, wealth, by the time you got to 2016, which were sort of the most up-to-date numbers I could find preparing for this, Black families' median wealth is about $17,000. White families' median wealth is about $171,000. And again, if you're looking to compare those two, Black families' median wealth, that median is about 10%, equivalent to 10% of that's typical for white families. And, just a quote that's pulled out of the article that presented these graphics, that, certainly disparities in income are important, and we can absolutely talk about disparities in income. But if you look at those racial wealth gaps, that's really what points to the consequences from what's been decades and decades, if not centuries and centuries, of discriminatory practices that affect not just jobs that are available to white workers and Black workers, but also increasingly housing and neighborhoods where whites and Blacks have lived. And what we're going to look at next, access to owning homes, whether you're an owner or renter. In that graph, what's typically the biggest chunk of families' wealth for the vast majority of families is their home, the value they have in their home. And so to figure out what's going on, why it is we're looking at those wealth gaps that are so incredibly large and so much greater than gaps in income, we got to start looking at what's going on with home ownership and who has access to owning property. Ironically, and we can talk about this too, that when you go back to coming out of the Civil War, the end of slavery and the Reconstruction period, a lot of the early push to figure out how to sort of transition out of slavery into an opportunity for more Americans to have access to more upward mobility, ownership of land was one of the earliest and strongest pushes. We went horribly awry, and we can talk about that too, but this idea of land ownership or home ownership in terms of building wealth and upward mobility is not a new concept. But so here's the graph for how the last 100 plus years of home ownership rates have looked. These lines show you the percentage of each group. We got Asian, Black, Hispanic, and whites shown on the graphic. What percentage of those groups have owned their homes as opposed to being renters over, certainly all of the 20th century, and now as we're coming into the 21st century. And so I've highlighted the numbers at either end of that spectrum, sort of shows you what the homeownership rate was for whites and Blacks back in 1900, and now what we're looking at for homeownership rates of whites and Blacks in 2016, again, the most recent trend line that I could find. Homeownership has increased, and in fact, we can talk about this too, a significant effort in terms of federal housing policy for a good chunk of the 20th century, certainly coming out of the New Deal into the 1930s, 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, a huge federal investment in homeownership, which is why you see those lines increase during that stretch of time from like the 40s into the early 60s. But what's true of this graph is you look from the beginning to the end of it, the gap in homeownership rates between whites and Blacks has been a steady story through this entire stretch, and if anything has only grown, so that there are 30 percentage points between the homeownership rates for whites and Blacks currently. And again, keep in mind that, again, just like we saw in that other graph, in the early 2000s, right around 2007, 2008, the economy hit the Great Recession. One of the big component parts of that was a foreclosure crisis and a big blow up of the housing market. And you can see what that meant for homeownership rates, across the board, but certainly what it meant for any gains in homeownership among, certainly you see among Blacks and Hispanics in that last stretch of the graph. So steady disparities. And so today, only about 41% of Black families own their homes, majority rent, and nearly 3/4, over 71% of white families own their homes. And that's been true. 2/3 of white households have owned their homes over the course of the last, 50 years. So that's not just one generation, that's 2, if not 3 generations who've been able to tap into homeownership. And now you're starting to see why that wealth gap stood at such a dramatic level. But then it gets worse. We're going to layer a few things on top of this. Speaking just for that blip of time during the Great Recession, sort of who was most at risk for the consequences of the housing market sort of exploding. These were risk rates for foreclosure. So people who are at risk of losing their homes. So among homeowners, who was a steadier homeowner or not, given the vulnerability of the loan they had on their home. And you can see that during this stretch, minority homeowners were significantly more likely to face foreclosure than white homeowners were, which is why, everybody's line towards the end of that last graph went down, but lines for, Black and Hispanic families when it came to homeownership went down even to a greater degree, why we got an even bigger gap. So even when we have access to homeownership, the stability of that homeownership doesn't look the same across racial groups. Here, again, I love my charts and graphs. I know people just don't enjoy them so much, but we're going to get to the maps momentarily, and we got more infographics, and so it's more fun. But hopefully these lines, what catch your eye is that period in the middle there. That's that Great Recession again, which these days, we've got so many other things on our minds, but it was a serious stretch of time. 2008, 2009, really didn't recover from it till about 2011, as you see those lines start to come down. This just, is to point out that one of the things, and we're going to increasingly be talking about this, in many cases, home ownership, the way in which you pay for your own personal housing is an individual household thing. It affects, your own personal residential stability. It affects your ability to grow wealth and pass wealth along to your kids. But it's also a neighborhood story. And so one of the things we're going to see quite a bit is how what's going on with individuals tend to get amplified, particularly when similarly positioned individuals or similar individuals all tend to live close to one another. And so you can see that here, separate from what might be going on with individuals, we saw that certain individuals were more at risk of foreclosure than others. We can absolutely talk about patterns of residential segregation. So the likelihood that Black households who had higher risk were living in neighborhoods with a lot of other Black households who also had higher risks meant that certain neighborhoods in particular bore the brunt of a lot of these impacts. And so you can see that, so majority Hispanic zip codes, Hispanics are more likely than whites to face foreclosure. Those zip codes that had large concentrations of Hispanic residents saw foreclosures increase dramatically. Those neighborhoods would be profoundly hard hit in the midst of the Great Recession. Other neighborhoods where there weren't as many, Hispanic or high-risk households living didn't fare as poorly. So not just who's more likely to own their home, who's more likely to have, stable loans that they don't face the risk of foreclosure. But then what happens when you look at what's going on with all your neighbors around you, the way in which we've organized ourselves into different communities tends to magnify these challenges in certain neighborhoods and mean that other neighborhoods don't even know a Great Recession is going on in the midst of this time. So individual households and whole neighborhood effects. And so what this tends to mean is that even where we've got access to home ownership, which is big gaps in who has access to home ownership, and big gaps in stability of that home ownership, but even where we've got home ownership, what that home ownership looks like, the value of homes, tends to be very different in different places. And so here's just something to think about. Sorry, the dog had to wake up. Here's just something to think about. These are two homes you see on the bottom, homes for sale at the exact same time. They were both on the market at the same time. If you look at the homes themselves, they are actually pretty similar in terms of the size of the homes, how many bedrooms they have, when they were built. From these are two brick, single story. If you're looking at them, one might have a couple more paint colors and shrubbery, but on the grand scheme of things, those two houses look pretty similar. Where these houses are only about 15 miles apart from one another. You can see them on the map above. The one on Louisa Avenue is in Ferguson, Missouri, which was where Michael Brown was shot and killed back in 2014. And that was in many cases sort of the if not the birth, then the galvanizing of the Black Lives Matter movement. Out of his murder, he was shot by police officers, and that led to significant protests and even rioting in Ferguson and Greater St. Louis. The Sanders Drive house is in Crestwood, Missouri, which is where Darren Wilson, who's the police officer who shot Michael Brown, where he lived. Ferguson and Crestwood are profoundly different communities in terms of their racial makeup and their, and you can see in terms of their property values. And we can talk about what another scholar I'll show you has come to find about the value of properties in neighborhoods, given the racial makeup of those neighborhoods. On the map there, you see I've flagged, there's a dashed arrow running across that I've labeled the Delmar Divide. Delmar Boulevard is a notorious street in Greater St. Louis. It stretches for that, you see that full stretch and extends in either direction. It has long served as sort of a racial dividing line, and you'll see maps of St. Louis in a second. You'll see where Delmar is on those maps, even though it's not visible or labeled. But that tends to be the spot at which neighborhoods prove to be dramatically different. It's a big dividing line in terms of white St. Louis and Black St. Louis. But you can see the value of those homes, that looking at them, other than, one has a few different paint colors and more greenery out front. Otherwise, these homes are nearly identical, how drastically different their values are. One was for sale, actually value was declining. It is now under $60,000. The other one is for sale for $155,000. About $100,000 difference between these homes. And so here again, by the time, once you even get past disparities in who has access to home ownership, what home ownership means as far as a wealth building vehicle, when you're living in a neighborhood with $150,000 homes versus $60,000 homes, is a big part of that story behind that wealth gap. One study that's recently come out, Andre Perry, who's there with his book, Know Your Price, is a great book talking a lot about the devaluing of Black neighborhoods and Black businesses and Black expertise sort of across the board, thinking about that in terms of changing the way in which we do community and economic development. One of the things he found out as he was doing his writing his book and thinking about his hometown of Wilkinsburg, a small borough right outside of Pittsburgh, was the way in which the value of property that otherwise is completely the same, shares the same sort of layout, size, materials, how different the value was between neighborhoods that were largely white and largely Black. And you can see what he's come up with there. On average, you're looking about $48,000 difference. We saw in that one example, the difference was even more than that. But even if you take any other differences in neighborhoods, whether it's amenities or safety, whatever it might be, houses in majority Black neighborhoods, as he calculated it, were valued about a quarter less than those in largely white ones. And you can see when you add that all up, how much of a loss that means. That devaluation is effectively over $150 billion worth of value and potential wealth for those neighborhoods that are undervalued. And the other thing that this gets us thinking about, and then I'll show you some maps and we can get talking about this, is that, again, this isn't just a function of wealth and the wealth gap. Our homes and the value of our homes fuel all, or not all, but a significant portion of local services, biggest being our schools. And so you layer these things on top of one another. Not only does this lead to wealth gaps in terms of home ownership, how valuable our homes are, even when we're homeowners, but also what this means for the resources that our schools, our public schools have, our recreational amenities that we're able to support with local taxes. Those kind of disparities all flow from these differences that we're finding. And if you think about it, this has become sort of a vicious cycle. One sort of builds on the other, that, higher valued homes that more people have access to creates wealth. It also generates higher quality schools that then boost the next generation towards greater income and more wealth. Either works in a vicious cycle, or a virtuous cycle, or it works in a vicious one. And again, we saw the length of some of these time horizons. We're 100+ years into a lot of this stuff, multiple generations. And so you do virtuous for multiple generations and things just keep booming. You do vicious for multiple generations and you can see why things move in the opposite direction. I got a bunch of maps about Baltimore, and if people want to see a bunch of maps about Baltimore, we can go through those too, but just so we can get to talking real quick, I'll show you maps on St. Louis, just so you can see. If people like playing around with maps, there's really no way to see these disparities like through maps. They're really pretty powerful. Opportunity Atlas is an amazing spot, and that's the site that I'm using to show you some of these things. But we can absolutely talk about other resources if you want to go online and do more with mapping. But for those of you who are not familiar with St. Louis, they've outlined the city of St. Louis, sort of like a semicircle there. The shading, the darker the shading, we're looking at the larger the portion of the population in these neighborhoods that's not white. And St. Louis is largely a white and Black city. It doesn't have a lot of diversity beyond that. And so this is largely what you're seeing is white versus Black. And so, like I said, you can't see where Delmar Boulevard is because the road is not labeled and it's a skinny one, so you're not even seeing the outline that is Delmar, but you can kind of see where Delmar Boulevard falls on this map, where all of a sudden the shading of the neighborhoods shifts pretty dramatically. So this gives you an idea what racial segregation looks like across greater St. Louis, one of the more segregated metropolitan areas we've got across the country. Layer on top of this, all those things we've talked about when it comes to access to home ownership, value of homes, you know, the concentration of foreclosure crisis during that stretch of time in the early 2000s, and what that meant for, you can imagine where the consequences of that were felt most severely across St. Louis. The other really interesting thing that this website has figured out, which relates to that other story, that it's not just individual household wealth, but sort of what this means for community, you know, public wealth, and how that translates into public services, amenities, and schools. We find that the opportunities that residents of different neighborhoods have, sort of where it is that kids growing up in different neighborhoods go in life, yeah, it depends on their own personal drive. Yes, it depends on the support that their family can provide them, but it also is heavily influenced by their neighborhood and the conditions and amenities and resources that their neighborhoods have to offer. And so here you have racial breakdowns across St. Louis. Here you have what opportunity looks like in St. Louis. This is a research team that's at Harvard. They've looked at millions of tax records and followed households over time. So looked at sort of the neighborhoods that kids were growing up in the 1990s, and now followed those kids to figure out where are they income-wise and well-being-wise as adults, so in their 30s. And then we're able to track that back to say, well, all right, well, how well did the neighborhoods they grew up in do in helping boost them to these different places? And so what you're seeing here, this map, is the grown-up income of kids who lived in these neighborhoods. So how well did neighborhoods do sort of springboarding their children to upward mobility? So those neighborhoods that are showing up in blue, kids that grew up in these places, you can see on the graph as adults, when, you know, this team checked back in with them, were earning incomes on the higher end of that spectrum. Anywhere in the red, you kids growing up in those neighborhoods check back in with them as adults, and they're on the lower end of that spectrum. And just to toggle back and forth between these two, you know, you start to see some similar patterns popping up, and all of this is, you know, that same story layered on top of each other, which, so yes, you see income disparities at one point in time, but this builds up to wealth disparities, which is what we started with. I can, like I said, we got lots of maps of Baltimore, but I want to sort of pause and see what questions people may have, or if we want to start talking about some of this stuff, if things didn't make sense, just so I'm not doing all the talking.
Yeah, I have one quick question. I know the housing market has really changed a lot because of COVID and people wanting to move away from cities. And I'm wondering what you have seen or what you would predict will be the impact on communities of color with people moving away from cities, and if many of these people, will this only increase that cost of housing in predominantly white neighborhoods, or will it also affect to some extent the increase of housing in predominantly Black and minority communities?
The million-dollar question, everyone is waiting to see how this all pans out. Absolutely. If we were to layer COVID experiences on top of these, let alone a whole range of other health indicators, and those are some of the maps that I have for Baltimore, all of those patterns, you start to see the same patterns again and again and again and again. So I don't have St. Louis's COVID data, and I haven't seen them, but what I have seen of other places, these same patterns you're seeing in the highs to the lows on these other maps reflect themselves in those COVID maps. Some of that has to do with sort of who's working the kinds of jobs that are easier to move remote, and where, you know, residents are often working jobs that you cannot shift gears and move remote, where those, you know, not only you have residents who have jobs that you can shift gears and work remotely, and they have maintained their employment because of that, and so haven't faced any kind of other than now having to figure out how to work from their closet, that's sort of the hardest thing that they've had to figure out how to do. Whereas others neighborhoods not only could face greater health risk because had to still report in person, but also, are in industries, whether they relate to, various service sector jobs or retail jobs that have seen a lot of job losses. And so different neighborhoods are grappling with the consequences, health consequences, economic consequences of the pandemic very, very differently. And so it has also meant that residents of some neighborhoods are very mobile. Their income has stayed the same. They're not tied down to any particular place. They're going to be telecommuting for the foreseeable future. And so they can choose to move wherever. And so certain cities, this is particularly true in like tech heavy cities, like San Francisco. New York has seen movement from some of its neighborhoods. And that's so the question is, what happens if cities start to lose that segment of their population? Whereas in other segments of their population are no more mobile today than they were before the pandemic, because their jobs are still tied to a particular location, or with the loss of jobs, they're not as flexible in terms of where it is they could move to. That's going to be the big question, what it means for a place like with a really overheated housing market like a San Francisco. Maybe this actually saves San Francisco's because it starts to take some pressure off of what's an insane housing crunch in some of those places. What it means for a St. Louis, it's the question, and cities have to figure out, is this going to be a long-term thing? Do we completely shift gears on all fronts? Or is this sort of a temporary blip that we need to wait it out? Given how some neighborhoods have seen profound consequences and others have, emerged largely unscathed, to me, I'm a city planner, so I think about neighborhoods and how they work for people, and sort of what the effects of, decades of community development work and housing policy work, what the consequences of that are. 2020 has been a big sort of reckoning year for me and those professions, because it's indicted a lot of the kinds of work we've done, and the fact that St. Louis has such profound residential segregation, the fact that conditions are so different across different neighborhoods, says that there's something about the way in which we've conducted housing policy and community development that really has not served people well. And so much like there's been reckonings around policing and criminal justice, these kinds of maps and the kinds of disparities we've got and the kinds of impacts COVID has had on different neighborhoods and different populations needs to sort of be a wake-up call for the way we've thought about housing or neighborhoods, or how we've supported different efforts along those lines, to me. I saw something pop up in the chat. I can I'm happy to share these slides more broadly if I know the video will be up, but I can certainly make the slides available too. And if, like I said, I can tease some Baltimore images if people want to see more. All maps, no more charts and graphs. You guys are done.
Yeah, I would be interested to see the maps. Also, I'd be interested to get your perspective on, like, on an individual level, like what we as citizens of the US can do to help problems like this that seem to be very complex.
Yes, certainly. This is a many decades in the making challenge, but all of the efforts to move equity sort of to the forefront and to start using equity to judge whether a policy idea or a public project or any kind of thing we're collectively putting our monies towards, where it is we're putting parks, how it is we're using green space, where it is we're investing in, walkability, or whatever it is we're thinking about when it comes to our public investment in places, to think about, to move equity to the forefront of that, will be helpful because it has, in terms of planning history, and we'll, when we move on to some other maps, I can give you some of that history. It was absolutely not at the forefront. And in fact, we were sort of explicitly targeting certain people for benefits and excluding others from those benefits. And so it's in many ways sort of baked into the way it is that so many of our cities and neighborhoods are organized. But that's not to say the way we invest in them going forward can't be handled differently, or we can't sort of change our thinking about how we go about doing these kinds of things. It's sort of one of the most powerful things that the conversations around criminal justice reform have done over the summer is just to say, wait, hold on a minute. Like so many of the policies we have are a function of momentum. We created them, we can change them. We can debate ways in which we want to change them, what makes for good changes versus bad changes. But let's not think for a minute that these like fell from the sky and are preordained. Like we can, if it doesn't seem like these are working, these are things that we can change. Housing and neighborhoods are tricky because so much of this stuff is stuff that gets built that then lasts, that even if you change your mind and we change our preferences, these buildings stick around for a long time. But that's not to say that we can't start sort of thinking about this differently, if that makes any sense. And I'd love to hear people's ideas for how and why. One more sort of thing to point out here, if people have heard the term redlining, which has popped up more and more and more. It was actually just, and I know today's kind of a big day as far as elections go. Redlining has not come up in previous, primary debates, presidential debates. We have not talked about fair housing. It came up a lot this time around, which is a positive sign because if we're not talking about it, then we're definitely not doing anything about it. But to give you an idea about sort of the history behind redlining, let's see. All of a sudden, there we go. Now we're moving. This is a historic map. The map you see on the right there is a historic map. I turned it so you're looking at St. Louis in the same, so the blob that is St. Louis looks the same on these different maps. These maps exist for many of our industrial cities. Any city that was of a significant size in the 1930s has a map that looks like this. These maps into the 1990s, which isn't that long ago, were like lost in a basement somewhere. And only over the course of about the last 20 years have these been unearthed. And, like I said, redlining, this idea has come up more and more. Redlining comes from these maps. It comes from these areas that you see in St. Louis that I don't know if you can see my mouse. This is where the arch is, any St. Louis folks. Or anybody who's been to St. Louis, that's the arch. And so here's the core of downtown. Anywhere that was drawn in red, that reflected a couple things that in the 1930s we felt were sort of a sign that a neighborhood was just absolutely on its way to destruction and its own demise. Housing in those areas were sort of old, it was denser, a lot of apartment buildings. Certainly if there was any degree of diversity. And again, in 1930s diversity, this could have meant religious diversity. This could have meant, most recent immigrant groups, but it certainly flagged any neighborhood that had any presence of African Americans. If you're red here, those, I don't know if we can see the legend is not on this, or it's super teeny tiny. You can't see what it says, but those areas would have been labeled hazardous. And what that meant at the time was it was hazardous for investment. If you were putting money into these areas, that was just a bad move. The only thing happening in these areas was ongoing decline. The only place to put investment, and this is an era when we're about to support significant increases in home ownership that we saw in some of those earlier graphs. The place to put monies in support of that is in anywhere that's sort of green and blue on this map. And so if you look at this, here's the city line. There's some stuff in the city. For the most part, this is stuff that exists outside the city line. Those were new places. Those were places that were single family homes, suburban style, new single family homes where you couldn't build any apartments. Those were often places that explicitly restricted residency to whites only. This is long before Brown versus Board of Education decided that separate was inherently unequal. This is long, 30 plus years, a full generation before we have fair housing at the end of the 1960s. And so these maps sort of set in motion. They were public, they were how public dollars were going to support private lending when it came to housing in neighborhoods. And they sort of set the rules to say the areas we feel are good bets are the newer neighborhoods, higher income, they're white neighborhoods, they've got single family homes where no apartments are allowed. And there are all these protections to make sure that the apartments will never be allowed and, minority residents will never be allowed in these places. That was 1930s. That sort of fueled and defined how it was we invested in places and people over the course of that stretch of time right after World War II, where we were pumping, billions of dollars into home ownership. And so you can start to see, again, some of these patterns that get set here, still, these are current, 2018, 2019, brand new data kind of maps, and you can see a lot of those patterns stay the same. And again, if you don't pull out these maps and have these maps out in front to think about, well, why is it that we have, significant disinvestment? We've seen such population loss in different parts of our city. If you do that without having a conversation on the map, it's been too easy to misallocate blame for how it is that disinvestment occurred. And just to sort of show you, Baltimore is another place. We'll look at this through Baltimore because maps are great. Here's Baltimore's. Baltimore's map, the olden days 1930s version. The map on the right is the same boundaries, just digitized. And some of this stretch here in the middle, this is sort of the heart of downtown. That's why it's not labeled here. It's just colored in red here. I'm not sure why the mapping that way. This area, if we're talking about sort of pivotal moments in criminal justice, police versus neighborhood interactions. We talked about Ferguson already. This is Sandown, Winchester, which is a neighborhood where a year after Michael Brown was shot and killed by police, Freddie Gray died in police custody, which led to some substantial protesting and rioting in Baltimore. But this was Freddie Gray's neighborhood. Here, Red Line neighborhood, and in the wake of his death, not only was there a conversation around criminal justice, but there was a conversation around his neighborhood and a reckoning with the fact that, well, let's look at how we've invested or disinvested in Sandown, Winchester over the last 80 years and what that's meant. And so here are all the ways in which this 1930s map affects current conditions across Baltimore. So again, we'll just run through a couple, see if your eyes can make these jump between maps to the different patterns. So here's that old 1930s map. So this is a dot map. This shows you by 2010, when we did our last decennial census, there's a dot for every person. And here gives you an idea of, based on the individual's race or ethnicity, that affects the color of their dot. And so you're seeing, if you can sort of, this stretch right here comes in this stretch right here, Druid Hill Park, just to orient you sort of right here on this map. But it gives you Baltimore, just like St. Louis, profoundly segregated city. You can see the degree to which you got some neighborhoods where you see a bunch of different color dots, all sort of nearby one another, but that's not true of the vast majority of Baltimore. Again, a relic of those maps and what they thought about integration and how they valued different races. So there you get to see current patterns of where people live based on race as of the last 2010 census. These dots here are for vacant buildings. So every dot is a vacant building, and that's not just vacant waiting for someone to move in. A lot of these are long-time vacant buildings that are in serious disrepair. And these dots sort of fully cover certain sections of these neighborhoods. And so you can imagine, talk about valuing and devaluing what values are like, let alone quality of life and conditions are like in these different places. Again, this pattern looks a lot like this pattern. This strip up here is this strip up here. Pretty powerful. We can talk to, one of the conversations this summer around policing brought back up the idea of broken windows policing, which is where sort of stop and frisk practices came from, which have come under a lot of, justifiable criticism. Interesting thing here is that, the idea behind the environment shaping people's behavior started with a conversation around broken windows. We got a whole lot of broken windows here, and instead of addressing these broken windows, we went down the rabbit hole of sort of criminalizing small actions or even particular people that were seen as a threat. But now there's more and more focus on, well, hold on a minute, what if instead we actually did something about broken windows? What would that mean for neighborhood safety and quality of life? Is another conversation we can have. This, again, just to sort of reinforce, not surprising, here's in this map, the lighter the shade, the lower the value. So this is sales per household. So the normalized sales of residential, commercial, and industrial real estate during a stretch of time, the recent stretch of time before since the last Great Recession, sort of up to the minute as best we could. But again, you see the very similar patterns that mirror the racial breakdowns and patterns that you see way back on this map from the 1930s. Here's the flip side. Now the shades are reversed. Darker the shaded, the higher the poverty rate. So it's not just about the place, but again, this connects to access to opportunity. But again, you see the same patterns. And speaking of opportunity, here's how Baltimore's opportunity map does. Ironically, we're looking a lot like we were way back in the 1930s. And so this is sort of how well or poorly different Baltimore neighborhoods springboard their children towards upward mobility. And you can see not well. Baltimore was one of those cities that scored towards the bottom in the assessment that these scholars had done of different places. So that's all my maps. So we have a Baltimore person on the call I would love to hear specifically, ideas, how you're digesting some of these maps, in the comments, talking about the limited resources that the city has towards doing something about this. So much, today is obviously a national election. We're talking about national politics and the policies that we set at the national level. So many of the programs and policies that affect your life are decided at the local level, and they're also paid for at the local level. And the biggest tax generating thing that the localities have is local property. So the way localities raise their money is they tax buildings, real estate property taxes that you might have heard about. And so the higher the value of property in a particular municipality, the more money that municipality is able to raise to pay for its schools or to pave its streets or its special events or to maintain its parks. Those are all local services to, fund its police and public safety efforts. The lower the property value, or if a property is vacant and no one's around to claim it, and so no one's around to pay taxes on it at all, the less resources that municipality will have to put towards all the things that it wants to do or needs to do. And two, that once you cross this line, that is the city line of Baltimore, you might have lots of high valued property over here. The money that's raised through property taxes on this high value property over here funds services over here. It does not then flow into the city of Baltimore to support the work that Baltimore needs to do. Which is a whole other level. And again, one of those reasons that, you're seeing a lot of red on this map, the ability of Baltimore to springboard its kids to upward mobility. It's doing the work of springboarding based on the resources it has to put towards springboarding. Less and less we put state dollars or federal dollars towards things like schools to help with upward mobility that way, which again has not fallen from the sky. That's something that we can absolutely think about. So those are all my maps.
Awesome. Professor Pooley, I have one question.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what what from the federal level and what from larger state levels, what can they do to make to change housing to be more equitable? And maybe another way to phrase this is, what does equity look like on a housing level? And how I know you kind of explained all of the aspects, but how do we make those changes, or how can we redraw some of these cities and these districts to help stuff? And I don't know. I was just wondering. Yeah.
We can change the boundaries we use to determine which local resources pay for which local services. And so, for example, a number of school districts throughout the South, and this was a function of school integration efforts that were mandated by the courts over a number of decades. Those districts are at the county level. They're county-wide school districts. They're not municipal school districts. They've made their districts much bigger. Other states, again, since states are operating higher than individual municipalities, use other tools to figure out how to make housing in different places more accessible, more affordable, and more fair. For example, New Jersey, is one of those, but the US Supreme Court sort of last ruled on municipalities excluding apartments from different neighborhoods, last ruled on that in the 1920s, really, and said, listen, if apartments just don't belong in some of these neighborhoods, we're going to leave that decision up to local officials to decide. New Jersey said, listen, if we have all these localities saying, no apartments in our town, no apartments in our town, that excludes a lot of New Jersey residents from a lot of these different municipalities. We're going to sort of obligate that as any of these municipalities grow, they need to make sure they're adding, affordable housing as they grow. And so implementing that has proven, easier said than done, but it's being done. And so New Jersey has seen more apartments placed in across different municipalities than other states have that aren't sort of explicitly on municipalities to make sure they're adding all types of housing for all income levels of people. It's the kind of money we make available to reinvest in neighborhoods that have seen substantial disinvestment. It's which protections we have in place that as we add amenities back into neighborhoods and the values increase, which is a good thing, but how we make sure that increase benefits longtime residents. So it helps build wealth for longtime residents and doesn't just displace longtime residents. We have not figured out how to do that successfully yet, but you can hear that debate and fight raging in a lot of cities that are seeing reinvestment and increases in prices. Philadelphia is not up here, but there are a lot of concerns about gentrification across different neighborhoods of Philadelphia. No shortage of work for you guys to do. So
yeah. I didn't even think about that. I actually had to do a project in my high school on that project because in my hometown we were having something related to that, I believe, in New Jersey Supreme Court case.
Mount Laurel. Yep.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I have no other questions. This is a very interesting talk, and I really appreciate you talking about this. I open up to anyone else to ask questions.
Hi, Professor Pooley. Thank you so much for hosting this, and really glad I was able to make the call. I was just wondering about what you were talking about with the St. Louis Arch and how it displaced the neighborhoods there that are, minority mainly. And I'm from Boston, so I've seen how, Boston displaced the Irish population in the early 1900s to make way for roads and new buildings. So it seems like it's a theme across many of these cities. And, something that I learned is that many of these neighborhoods lacked political capital to fight back against these new developments and the gentrification. So I was just wondering, what do you think is the best way to enhance these neighborhoods to have more political capital to fight back and really represent themselves against unjust encroachment?
Yeah, fantastic point. And Boston is such an interesting case study that, you named a number of other things. Not only were we encouraging homeownership during this stretch of time after World War II, but one of the things we were doing, I brought this map back up here so you could see the redlined areas. We labeled these areas redlined, hazardous places for investment. And so none of those homeownership dollars flow into these places. The money that does is that urban renewal and highway construction. These are the neighborhoods where we build. We tear blocks down and build highways. We tear blocks down and build, whether it's public housing or a Lincoln Center or, office parks of various kinds. We replace a lot of housing in these neighborhoods with other stuff or for housing for other people. Because we devalue not only these places, but the people who are in these places. In one of the classes I'm teaching this semester, we're talking about this map for Detroit, and you're looking at the 1950s plan for Detroit. It's looking at its downtown neighborhoods and it's saying, gosh, place is just a mess. It's really best use is as vacant land. Just so happens that 380,000 people live here, but really there's nothing we can do with this part of town anymore. And it's like that's a pretty big, 380,000 people. That's like, a Minneapolis, that's a bigger than Pittsburgh that we're just going to sort of write up. The best thing we can do with this part of town is just sort of level it and start again. One of the challenges is the people doing this work over the course of World War II and even today, the professionals who, have the best interests of these places in mind are only bringing a narrow perspective. It's not a diverse profession, which is a big challenge that we have to do across a number of different professions. And, it was in 2019 that the American Planning Association put out sort of an equity plan for its professionals. 2019, we did make it, planning profession's been around since, the late 1800s. But so to have a moment where you sort of stop and catch those moments where suddenly we're talking about a place where 300,000 people live is a place that we should be throwing out. Whoa. We need a mechanism that sort of prevents that from happening. It's tricky because you're right, the loudest voices and those neighborhoods that are most connected were not these redlined areas. Or, in Boston, it was not the West End that got demolished. Or those neighborhoods that ended up, the path of the highways. Again, that becomes the responsibility of, people conducting this work to make sure that the policies have, into the planning process has been inserted more moments where community participation is required. But community participation could be like, we scheduled something at 5 o'clock on Tuesday, nobody showed up, but we did it, we had the meeting, so that we're going to check that box. Or it can be actually saying, no, we're not considering this as having been done until we have absolutely received word and feedback and grown a conversation in this neighborhood around it. And so there's movement, but there's way more work to do along those lines. We've gotten better at true community engagement, but there's a lot more work to do. And then what happens when you have, two different parties with a different vision for a neighborhood, how you navigate, how there's room for both of those visions and one doesn't drown out the other. Really, really tricky. Boston is such an interesting case study right now. Because a lot of the damaging work that they did with some of the highway construction, they've removed the highways, and now the challenge becomes, who gets to benefit from neighborhoods that now aren't under elevated highways? Yeah, really, really interesting case study.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Well, if there's no more questions, I think this has been a wonderful talk, and I'd like to thank you, Professor Pooley, on behalf of David and all the other people that were helping with this. This has been awesome, and I really appreciate taking your time to educate us.
No problem. Thank you guys for organizing today in general and for all the work that's gone on getting us to having a day like this, and for so many students taking the time out to vote today. It's fantastic.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thanks a lot.
Again.